Humans. I'm one. And you are too. Probably. Hey, are we special? Now, I don't mean to ask whether we're unique. Obviously, humans do things that no other organisms do. What I mean to ask is, are we special in a moral sense? Do human lives deserve to be privileged over others? Anthropocentrism is a view that says, yes, we are. The term can be used to describe any view that privileges human interests over others, and where moral value is rooted in humanity. Anthropocentric tendencies are quite ubiquitous in our society, leading to our treatment of other species and our alienation from the natural dynamics of ecosystems. These many problems have motivated the promotion of several alternative views which seek to replace anthropocentric thinking. In this video, we'll explore some of these views, and I'll give some reasons why I think sentiocentrism is the best. Before we begin, we need to cover some terminology in the philosophy of moral scope. Generally speaking, there are two ways that we can value something. Instrumental value is when we value something as a means to an end. Terminal value is when we value something for its own sake as an end, not as a means to achieve anything else. For example, I value putting on my shoes, but I do so instrumentally. I value putting on my shoes because I value my feet not getting wet. I value my feet not getting wet because my feet getting wet causes me suffering. I value not suffering because I value not suffering. There's not much else to it. Avoiding suffering is a terminal value. Moral scope refers to the set of entities considered to have moral status, meaning the set of entities to whom we assign terminal value. In other words, an entity has moral status if we consider it to be an end in itself, not only as a means to achieve anything else. Anthropocentrism assigns moral status only to human interests, meaning that everything else outside of human interests is morally considerable only as much as it advances human interests. While anthropocentric worldviews assign only human beings terminal value, they may still assign non-human beings instrumental value. For example, ecosystems provide vital services, and so under an anthropocentric worldview, we may still value these things and promote them in order for human beings to survive. However, anthropocentrism is not capable of granting non-human entities terminal value. The ecosystem is only valuable insofar as it provides value to humans. The task of finding a suitable moral scope involves justifying a principle that we can use to decide which entities are assigned terminal value, and thus moral status. One way to start is to ask what it is about us humans which grants us considerability. If we can identify the characteristic that makes humans deserve moral value, we can extrapolate that value to other beings who share that characteristic. Here's what that looks like as a formal argument. Premise 1 would be that humans are morally valuable on account of our possession of some characteristic called C. Premise 2, like cases should be treated alike. Therefore, all entities which possess characteristic C are morally valuable. So let's take a look at some of the different characteristics that we can base our moral scope on. Let's start with the characteristic that is behind much of anthropocentric intuitions, and that is being a member of the human species. The good news is that if being a human being is the morally relevant characteristic we choose, we don't have to abandon anthropocentrism, because it follows that all and only human beings will possess moral value. The bad news is that species membership is not a suitable characteristic to base our morality on. Basing the moral value of a being on their membership in a species is a form of discrimination known as speciesism. Like some other forms of discrimination, such as sexism and racism, speciesism discriminates based on a characteristic which is not morally relevant. A species is a biological classification grouping together similar organisms based on their ability to produce offspring. Drawing the lines of our morality around such a classification is an arbitrary restriction, and like other forms of discrimination, these lines are almost always drawn to benefit the drawer. Imagine if you were able to genetically modify yourself to the point of no longer being able to reproduce with most humans. Would your moral value change? Even if you had the same thoughts, the same feelings, the same characteristics as before? Of course it wouldn't. Your moral value wouldn't change until your genetic modification changed the characteristics which make you morally valuable, of which your species is not. When we say that all humans are morally valuable by virtue of being human, we don't usually mean that it's because of our membership within a biological taxonomy. Instead, we are implying a trait that human beings are supposed to have. So, let's go back to our question. What characteristic do humans possess which grants us moral status? Another possible answer is to say that intelligence, or sapience, is the characteristic behind the moral value of humans. We deserve moral consideration because we are self-conscious, rational agents, capable of forming beliefs about the world and making plans for the future. This view, which we'll call rationalism, can be justified by basing moral value on the ability to make decisions based on a sense of right and wrong, known as moral agency. Unlike the belonging to a species, moral agency is a characteristic that is relevant to ethics, and thus, rationalism is less arbitrary than speciesism. However, rationalism is unable to justify the restriction of moral value to human beings, and in some cases is unable to justify the provision of moral value to human beings. This is demonstrated by the argument for marginal cases. The core idea behind the argument for marginal cases is that there is no morally relevant characteristic that we can use to grant moral consideration to all and only human beings. Let's say that we choose intelligence as the characteristic. Even though that most humans are more intelligent than most non-humans, it isn't true that all humans are more intelligent than all non-humans. At the margin of the least intelligent humans, such as infants, and the most intelligent non-humans, such as corvids, we have cases where some non-humans are more intelligent than some humans. Depending on where we draw the line for how intelligent an entity needs to be to deserve moral consideration, we will either end up excluding some humans or including some non-humans. We can run this argument on any trait that isn't arbitrary, like species membership, and we'll get the same result of being unable to save anthropocentrism. If we draw the line at moral agency, we can't even provide moral status to all human beings, because there are some humans, like infants, who are not capable of moral reasoning. At this point, we could accept rationalism as our moral scope, but I think it's safe to say that most people wouldn't accept morality which cannot provide consideration to human infants. So let's move on. Instead of asking what characteristic it is that makes humans in general morally considerable, let's extrapolate from the morally relevant characteristics of a baby. How about this? The baby has moral status because the baby is a living being, and therefore all living beings deserve moral consideration. This is known as bio-centrism, and it's a view with modern origins in environmental ethics. Before we continue, let's clarify two more important terms, and they are intrinsic and extrinsic value. Intrinsic value is value that is inherent to an entity and is independent from other entities, whereas extrinsic value is dependent on a valuer. My chair, for example, has extrinsic value dependent on me valuing it, but if I wasn't here to sit on it, it wouldn't value itself, so it is not a source of intrinsic value. My dog has extrinsic value dependent on me valuing him, but even if I wasn't here, he would still value himself. He is a valuer and thus a source of intrinsic value. Try not to get the different forms of value mixed up. Intrinsic and extrinsic value are objective. They concern the locations of different valuers in reality. Instrumental and terminal value are subjective. They concern the normative stance of a valuer. One way of justifying bio-centrism is by including all entities who possess intrinsic value, value that is independent of other entities. Living systems don't just passively move along with their environments, they actively absorb information and use it to execute behaviors. These behaviors aren't random, they are goal-directed towards reproduction and growth. Thus, living systems have interests, they are valuers and are sources of intrinsic value. Biocentrism holds that we ought to respect these interests, whether they take the form of the smallest microorganisms or the largest forests. This articulation of biocentrism has some interesting implications. First, it shouldn't matter where an entity originated, whether it's the result of billions of years of natural evolution or a laboratory experiment. If it has its own interests, it deserves moral consideration. Second, it shouldn't matter what material these interests are implemented in. The future of artificial intelligence may involve the creation of entities who have their own interests, by virtue of being intelligent independent of our control. This form of biocentrism has no way of denying these beings moral status, even if their interests are vastly different from those of living organisms. While these implications may not worry some, others may find it difficult to accept. A deeper objection to biocentrism was articulated by philosopher Joel McClellan as the normativity gap. While biocentrism is adept at describing the intrinsic value that life has, it isn't able to make a strong case prescribing that we assign moral status to life. There's a gap between what is good and what we ought to do about it. We can accept that living organisms have interests, but it's not clear why those interests should obligate us moral agents to care. Why do we care about the baby? Is it really because the baby is a living being with intrinsic value, or is it something else? Does the baby really have interests in the same way that a tree or an artificial intelligence have interests? Well, there is a way to distinguish between these kinds of interests. The philosopher Tom Regan distinguished between welfare interests and preference interests. Welfare interests are what is in the interests of an entity, whereas preference interests are what an entity is interested in. While at first these may seem identical, there is a subtle distinction. Welfare interests are possessed by any entity for which certain states are better than others. Preference interests, on the other hand, require an entity to have desires. My kale plants have welfare interests because they do have goods of their own. Pulling out the roots would be bad for the plants because it would deny them the growth they clearly strive for. But the plants don't have preference interests because they aren't actually interested in any of this. They lack the psychological capacity to have desires. Thus, preference interests are restricted to sentient beings, beings who consciously experience their interests. So, a final answer to why the baby has moral status is not that the baby has interests, but that the fulfillment or non-fulfillment of those interests results in sensations that are experienced by a conscious being as good or bad. This view is known as Sentio-centrism, and it holds that sentience is necessary and sufficient for moral status. So, what exactly is sentience? The good news is that we don't have to commit ourselves to any specific view on what sentience is and how it works. Those are interesting philosophical and scientific questions, but all that matters to sentiocentrism is that we acknowledge what sentience is on the level of sentient experience. You're acquainted with it right now. You experience the world through its effect on your consciousness. You intuitively know why emotions like joy are good and why experiences like pain are bad. Because of this, sentiocentrism isn't subject to the same normativity problem as biocentrism. It isn't clear why we should care about entities with interests whose fulfillment does not result in conscious experience, but it is clear why we should care about the satisfaction of preference interests. We are intimately acquainted with how it feels to have our desires unfulfilled. We can reason about what it is like to be the subject of another's experience, and if morality is about anything, it's about determining our actions based on a concern for others. Others who? What is the set of sentient beings? Well, humans are sentient in all but the most marginal cases of irreversible brain death. Humans are not unique in possessing the neural structures correlated with consciousness, meaning many other animals, particularly those with a central nervous system, probably are as well. Depending on your view of the nature of consciousness, it may be possible to create artificial sentience, and because it doesn't matter what material the sentience is manifested in, those minds would be considerable as well. This also applies to extraterrestrial sentience. If beings elsewhere in the universe have preference interests, if they consciously experience their value, then they deserve moral consideration. Sentiocentrism is, in my opinion, the best answer to the question of which beings deserve moral status. Ultimately, I care about myself and others because we are the subject of conscious experience, not because of species membership, intelligence, or goal-directedness. I care about ecology and sustainability not for their own sakes, but for the sakes of the individuals who rely on them. However, not everyone agrees with that. The views we've covered so far all operate on the assumption that only individuals, whether they be individual humans, rational agents, living organisms, or sentient beings, can be subjects of moral consideration. However, some views reject this assumption and hold that in addition to individuals, aggregates of individuals, collective entities also deserve moral consideration. A view known as eco-centrism, popular in environmental ethics, argues that collective entities such as species and ecosystems, as well as some abiotic entities such as lands and rivers, have intrinsic value and thus moral status. Eco-centrism sees the focus on individuals as a theoretical inadequacy because of the inability to protect ecosystems and communities for their own sakes. It argues that we should adopt a holistic view where individual organisms, species, communities of species, ecosystems integrated with soils and rivers, and even the global biosphere itself are all subjects of moral value. A popular version of ecocentrism known as the land ethic was articulated by philosopher and ecologist Aldo Leopold, who said that, quote, A thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It is wrong when it tends otherwise." End quote. There are several reasons why we might reject ecocentrism. First, it isn't clear whether collective entities actually have their own interests. Ecosystems are collections of individual organisms, and it isn't clear what level of integration exists between them. For example, your body is made of trillions of cells, each of which has a limited level of autonomy, but all of which are closely integrated together to form the collective entity known as you, the organism. On the other hand, a crowd of people made up of thousands of individuals exhibits complex behavior, but there is no integration. The individuals just happen to be existing in the same place at the same time. It isn't clear what level of integration biotic communities have. While we can observe ecosystems acting in ways which preserve themselves, establishing collective goal-directedness, and thus interests, is a tricky empirical problem, because the same behavior could be a byproduct of the goal-directedness of many individuals. If it's true that ecosystems do not have their own interests, then we can't reasonably speak of bringing harm to them outside of the harm done to their individual members. If integrated wholes exist only in our perception, then they cannot be subjects of direct moral consideration. Even if ecosystems do exist as integrated wholes and do have their own interests, ecocentrism still faces the same normativity problem as biocentrism, because while it may be true that they have intrinsic value, it does not automatically follow that moral agents ought to assign them terminal value. Ecocentrism's perception of the inability of individualistic theories to grant direct moral consideration to ecosystems is true. But while sentiocentrism cannot assign terminal value to ecosystems, it can still value them instrumentally. We can still preserve habitats, but will do so for the sake of the sentient beings who live there, not for the ecosystem itself. Sentiocentrism sees much of the ecocentric focus on complexity, richness, and diversity as wrong-headed, because such aesthetic concerns can only matter once they have an impact on individuals. Preserving endangered species, for example, is often done because we don't want to live in a less diverse and beautiful world, rather than for the sake of the sentient beings who are members of those species. Non-human sentients are often viewed in terms of their species, or as expressions of nature itself, rather than as individual conscious creatures. At its worst, this can result in the prioritization of collective entities who do not themselves have interests over the real lived experience of sentient individuals. Alright, before we end this video, it's important to note that everything we've said about moral scope refers only to the boundary of what is and what isn't morally considerable. How different entities within our moral scope are considered in relation to each other is a different question entirely. For example, being a bio or a sentiocentrist does not necessarily mean that you believe that all living beings or all sentient beings deserve equal moral consideration. You could believe that, but you could also believe that they deserve differing levels of consideration based on other characteristics. Comparing the different variations of these views is not a part of this video, but I do have a video on the multidimensional nature of sentience, which is somewhat relevant to this question, so if you're interested in that, check it out. I'd love to hear where you stand on the question of moral scope, so if you have any thoughts on that, be sure to leave a comment below. I make videos about futurism from a sentientist, eco-socialist perspective, so if that's your thing, make sure to subscribe. I also did start a Patreon, so if you'd like to support my work, you can check that out. But until next time, peace out.